I do draw the first part of my title this evening, Discipleship or Duplicity, from world-renowned theologian and one of my own beloved mentors, M. Shawn Copeland. In her book, Knowing Christ Crucified, Dr. Copeland contrasts two paths that have been well-worn in our nation, both claiming the name Christian. One of those well-worn paths involves authentic discipleship, genuine struggle to follow the way, the truth, and the life in the person of Jesus Christ, crucified by the people and power of state-sanctioned violence and risen from the dead in opposition to that power. For Copeland and for other Black American theologians like James Cone, this is the path trod by enslaved Christians. Black Christians in the so-called New World developed faith in Jesus, who they believed to be the Son of the same God who delivered the Israelite slaves from bondage in Egypt. In Jesus, they saw their liberator and the inspiration for their survival and resistance. Copeland calls this faith the dark wisdom of the enslaved. Describing his own Christian faith experience in similar terms, James Cone notes that the white Christians of his youth in Arkansas, quote, did everything within their power to define Black reality, to tell us who we were. And their definition, of course, extended no further than their social, political, and economic interests. They tried to make us believe that God created Black people to be white people's servants, end quote. Cone shows that the enslaved embraced Christianity because in it they found proof of their humanity and dignity, power for survival, and hope for freedom in the midst of demeaning and deadly white power. Black slaves, argues Cone, believed that just as God had delivered Moses and the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, God also will deliver Black people from American slavery. Faith in the God of Moses was a form of self-affirmation that contrasted jarringly with white ideas about Black personhood. While the faith of both Black and white people bore a single name, Christianity, they professed and practiced starkly different religions. They shared sacred texts, narratives, and even religious rituals, yet Cone remarks, when the master and the slave spoke of God, they could not possibly be referring to the same reality. So, permit me, if you will, for a moment, a litany that exposes these two paths, one of discipleship and one of duplicity. Because I would argue that the path, the trajectory of authentic discipleship carries on. We could find traces of it in the post-war Protestant social gospel movement of Walter Rauschenbusch and Jane Addams, and the early 20th century Catholic worker movement of Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin. We would find it flourishing in the theological writings of Howard Thurman and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in the practices of the civil rights movement and the organizing of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta's United Farm Workers Union. Today, the path of authentic discipleship is struggling for theological airtime. Wherever Christianity enters the public square, it is struggling for theological airtime. It can be found among Christians against Christian nationalism, which I'll discuss further a little later. And it's thriving in academic theology and religious ethics, where despite the best efforts of culture warriors to destroy things like critical race theory, a multiracial community of scholars in religion and theology embrace its tools to understand and analyze white privilege and the long-lasting effects of unequal power dynamics that have led to the need for all of us to embrace the today mocked and assaulted human and humane values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Outside of academia, Reverend Dr. William Barber's Poor People's Campaign and Moral Mondays movement are the inheritors of the trajectory of Christianity that is good news for the poor and vulnerable, for migrants and refugees, for people of color, for LGBTQ folks, and for all their allies who see in Jesus Christ the liberator of humankind from all forms of humiliation, dehumanization, and captivity. But tonight we will focus on Christian nationalism, which has done much to build the second path, the well-worn way of duplicity, that is dishonesty and inauthenticity, a claim to be following the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus that in fact perverts it. The duplicitous path has been trod in this land since the 1400s by colonizers, enslavers, and white supremacists who perverted faith in the crucified God and used the name of Jesus to support claims of manifest destiny that killed indigenous people and drove them from their land, stole their children, and polluted their waterways. On this path, white Christians enslaved folks with brown skin for the sake of a strong economy and waged a civil war that killed nearly 700,000 soldiers to protect that slavery, which Jefferson Davis insisted was a Christian institution and indeed the, quote, greatest source of permanent blessing, end quote, for those of African descent. Yeah, let that sit for a minute. This trajectory continued with the reign of terror we call lynching, during which nearly 5,000 black people were tortured and executed without due process as celebrations of white Christian vigilante justice. It thrived under Jim Crow laws, which were robustly defended by Christian pastors from the pulpit as, quote, God's plan for the races, end quote. In more recent years, the path of duplicity led through Charlottesville, where white Christians shouted, "Jews will not replace us," and one drove his car into a large group of protesters, killing Heather Heyer. This path was vividly manifest on January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C., where charismatic Christians prayed that Donald Trump, though he lost the election, would remain president, as a violent mob stormed the Capitol building with the same goal. 7 people died, either due to direct injuries from that day or indirect medical incidences, including strokes and suicide. Roughly 150 law enforcement officers were injured as Christians pled the blood of Jesus over the Capitol. Even more recently, Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, were murdered in their home in the name of Jesus' pro-life values. Today, the Christians of this duplicitous path build prisons for mostly nonviolent, poor migrants and refugees, and give them names that are either funny and cute or cruel and repugnant, depending on your perspective, I guess. Alligator Alcatraz and Cornhusker Clink and Speedway Slammer. So enough on why this is my title. And I'm going to take off my preaching hat and put on my professor's mortarboard, because I'm going to start to get a little more academic. Because we do need clear thinking about Christian nationalism, what it is, how it functions, what its goals are. And over the next, I don't know where I'm at, but maybe 20 minutes or so, I want to dig into what Christian nationalism is by thinking about it from 3 different disciplinary perspectives: philosophy, sociology, and theology. So I believe, let's see. Yeah, we're going to start with Aristotle. So to understand Christian nationalism, I want us to start with just getting a handle on what nationalism is. And for that, I'm going to enlist Aristotle's help. If you had a liberal arts or humanities background, you probably had to study this guy at some point. an ancient Greek philosopher whose major life project was to think about how we can ethically live together in communities, the polis, that make all of us more virtuous and, according to him, thus happier people. In support of this end, Aristotle cultivated a way of thinking about virtue and vice that later was drawn into the Christian tradition, especially by Thomas Aquinas. And these were considered to be helpful tools for thinking about how to do good and avoid evil. Aristotle develops his virtue theory as a kind of mathematical metaphor. And let me be clear, I am terrible at math, so we are not going anywhere near like AP calculus levels here tonight. He described virtue as the mean, the midpoint between two extremes, or vices, and all within particular spheres of feelings or actions. One extreme represents a vice of excess of those feelings, and the other represents a deficiency. To gain virtue and thus happiness, and in Christian terms, avoid sin and do good and seek union with God, people should strive for that middle ground. The Goldilocks principle. Not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, just right. But this is not a call to timidity. Or tepidness. It's not the lukewarm water. Aristotle thought that we should be extremists in one thing only, and that is virtue. To relate Aristotle to nationalism, let's imagine a sphere of feelings about one's country. Here, I think, we can all understand why I would put the virtue of patriotism here. It's an appropriate love of country. Patriotism enables us to promote our national well-being by pursuing the common good. Catholic social teaching says the common good involves three things: the rights of individuals, the well-being of the community itself, and peace and security. I'm going back to that class you had with me probably 10 or 15 years ago now. So a thick description of patriotism then, from the perspective of Catholic ethics, would demand that appropriate love of country involve advocacy for personal human rights, including rights to religious liberty, access to healthcare and education, the right to vote, the right to due process if we're accused of violating the law. Second, patriotism would mean caring for our local communities through the maintenance of public infrastructure, clean air and water, parks and bike trails and green spaces. And it would mean peace and security, safety at all levels of society for everyone, whether in our neighborhoods or through national and domestic foreign policy. If patriotism involves all this in the pursuit of common good, then it also demands dissent and protest against policies that oppose the common good. This strikes me as a worthy goal for the virtue of patriotism in our country today. Every person living in our country should have their human rights respected and protected by law. Our communities should thrive in and of themselves, and we ought to be able to live in safety and peace. This is the kind of America that I can pray for God to bless. If patriotism is a virtue that encourages proper love of country, then nationalism is a vice of excess. And you'll notice on that previous slide, my deficiency, I'm still thinking about it, right? I had like question marks around that. But in terms of the vice of excess, a nationalist has too much love of country. Aristotle would say things like, they love their country in the wrong way, about the wrong things, for the wrong reasons, and without sufficient and appropriate critique. Nationalists seek to preserve the nation, usually, but not always ethnically identified, even at the expense of other goods and virtues, including those necessary to pursue and preserve the common good. So that was relatively easy for philosophy, right? I mean, not bad, pretty easy, even though it was math. So let's look at sociology of religion for just a moment. And I think that I I want to argue that sociology of religion is helping us understand what that qualifier means, Christian, in the Christian nationalism. Philip Gorski, Samuel Perry, and Andrew Whitehead provide lucid sociological accounts of Christian nationalism in the United States today. In their 2020 book, Taking America Back for God, Perry and Whitehead define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. They clarify, and this is really important, that the Christianity of Christian nationalism is of a particular sort. They're not theologians, so they don't dig in further than that, right? They're sociologists, but they can see enough to say it's something more than religion. It includes nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. It is as ethnic and political as it is religious. And I want you to think a little bit about how that resonates with that litany of duplicitousness that I spoke about before. Christian nationalism is an ideology born of real or perceived grievance and seeking exclusionary politics along with social hierarchies. So think traditional gender roles, the suppression of LGBTQ visibility, structural and cultural racism, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's based most clearly on white American citizenship, conservatism, and at least nominal identification with Christianity, usually but not always evangelical or charismatic Christianity. On grievance, scholars point out that, quote, Christian nationalism not only affirms a uniquely American Christian history, but also highlights the alleged danger to that heritage from rapid demographic, legal, and political change. Gorski and Perry explore that exclusivist ethnic nature of Christian nationalism in their book, The Flag and the Cross. They demonstrate that Christian nationalists are overwhelmingly white, politically conservative, evangelical Christians, though with this crowd, I think it's really important that I emphasize that a large number of Roman Catholics also embrace or accommodate Christian nationalism. 30% of those who are considered accommodators of Christian nationalism are Catholics. And that means they are leaning towards accepting the precepts and beliefs and ideas of Christian nationalism. Perry and Whitehead conducted a series of surveys, and you're seeing some of the results here in graph form, to determine what degree Christian nationalist commitments correlate with a variety of other theological and political indicators. Just to summarize, they found a high positive correlation with the following: identifying as politically conservative and as Bible-believing, the belief that the Bible is the literal word of God and perfectly true, regular religious practice, so praying, a belief that the nation is, quote, on the brink of a moral decay, end quote, and a belief that, quote, God requires the faithful to wage wars for good. And finally, a belief in a literal rapture in which faithful Christians will be whisked into heaven while the rest of humanity suffers through a bloody period of violence on earth during the end times. This correlation between Christian nationalism and violence, including acceptance of violence as a means for pursuing political ends, is deeply alarming, but it helps to explain a lot these days, including the convergence of some Christian conservatives with groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. It's also worth being mindful that while Christian nationalism in the US is historically associated with patriarchy and white supremacy, one of the most powerful networks pursuing Christian nationalist politics today accepts women's religious authority and leadership and is multi-ethnic. I'm referring to an affiliation of evangelical Christian charismatics called the New Apostolic Reformation. This network, which includes women pastors like Paula White, who's the personal pastor to President Trump, and Che An, the son of Vietnamese immigrants, is arguably the most influential Christian group with power in the current administration. And I am indebted for what it's worth to the research of Matthew Taylor, who shows how this particular brand of Christian nationalism is more about Christian supremacy than white supremacy or ethnic purity. It's dedicated to privileging Christianity as the official religion of the US, and frankly would like to see it everywhere else, which is touchy because we do believe in evangelization. And yet, in its most extreme forms, it would end religious pluralism. I should also say, and I don't know if I say it adequately in what I've written here, but I'll speak for just a moment to say it is very important also to keep in mind that not all evangelicals are Christian nationalists, not all white evangelicals are Christian nationalists. And one of the reasons why that's so very important is because the voices within white conservative evangelicalism that are speaking out against Christian nationalism are the ones that are most likely to actually have the ear of fellows who are struggling with this. Does that make sense? Yes. Thank you. Okay. All right. So all of this sociology of religion sets us up well for a little bit of theological exploration of Christian nationalism. So theologically speaking, Christian nationalism is first and foremost a violation of the first commandment. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have other gods beside me. It's a form of idolatry, which I would argue is an offshoot of the deadly sin of pride, an excessive belief in one's own or one's group's goodness or moral superiority or just general excellence and superiority. I'm trying here, and I'm not sure I'm succeeding, to tie pride and idolatry together. So I see some theologians in the audience, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this at some point, right? But I'm trying to. Pride was a favorite topic of St. Augustine, whose feast day Catholics celebrated just last week, and who I just happened to discuss with my graduate students today. Also, for Augustine, all sin is the result of loving transient, impermanent goods more than the eternal and living God. I'll say it again. All sin is the result of loving transient and impermanent goods, including one's country, more than the eternal and living God. In this way, all sin is a kind of idolatry, whereby we replace God with some other object of our desire or affection. With pride, we make ourselves, or maybe our groups, into little gods. In the case of Christian nationalism, the purported excellence of one's nation and one's particular brand of Christianity becomes an object of worship. God becomes the American God. The Ecumenical Education and Advocacy Organization, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, makes the point. Christian nationalism uses the veneer of Christianity to advance its own aims, to point to a political party or figure or ideology instead of Jesus. This practice, they continue, of conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous. Similarly, the loosely organized group of scholars known as Ethicists Without Borders wrote in their 2017 statement responding to the rising so-called alt-right and their deadly Charlottesville protests, "We reject the idolatrous notion of a national God. God cannot be reduced to America's God." So, if we can agree that the chief sin of Christian nationalism is idolatry, then it remains for us to think about what shape that idolatry takes. how is the worship that ought to be reserved for the living God directed towards something else? In a kind of intellectual and spiritual autobiography called American Idolatry, I'm getting a nice reading list here tonight, Andrew Whitehead, one of the sociologists I discussed earlier, recounts his journey disentangling his own Christian faith from nationalism. He thinks that American Christian nationalism involves making three idols: one to power, another to fear, and a third to violence. I'll offer a brief description of each, demonstrating that this trifold idolatry is helpful, but I think it's a little incomplete or insufficient. So Christian nationalism, says Whitehead, is wholly obsessed with acquiring and maintaining power that will secure privileges and position for members of the Christian in-group, while other folks will exist in, quote, lower sections of the social hierarchy in accordance with what advocates of Christian nationalism insist is, quote, the will of God, end quote. At the same time, Christian nationalism cultivates the idol of fear to keep folks in the mindset of constant threat to the in-group. Recall the point I made earlier about grievance. Christian nationalism, quote, operates from a scarcity mindset that there is not enough for all of us to experience abundance. In the Christian nationalist mindset, power and fear are in sync. Fear makes Christian nationalists seek more power so they can wield it to protect their status and privilege. And finally, Christian nationalism is, quote, completely comfortable with and at times demands the use of violence. Indeed, Christian nationalism advocates, quote, authoritarian and social control that includes the threat and use of violence, often to secure, quote, strict ethno-racial boundaries, designating who can fully participate in American civic life, end quote. I imagine you can conjure examples of this from today, but I do think it's very easy to see the work of lynching as that use of violence to secure strict ethno-racial boundaries, designating who can fully participate in American civic life. To summarize these three idols, power, fear, and violence, Christian nationalists typically see conservative Christians as persecuted in American culture and society, with some surveys showing that they see white evangelical Christians as, quote, the most discriminated against group in all the US. This fear of persecution legitimizes a quest for power as domination and the use of violence to maintain that power. So while I think that Whitehead's assessment of these three interlocking idols is helpful in understanding some of the dynamics associated with Christian nationalism, I don't think it fully reckons with the problem of idolatry. In particular, I think it's missing something that Christians Against Christian Nationalism and Christian Ethicists Without Borders are pointing to, and that is the idea of God as the American God or a national God. Whitehead's trifold idolatry, it doesn't quite get us to manifest destiny. It doesn't quite get us to the persistent belief among Christian nationalists that America has some kind of special status in God's kingdom, and we need to get a better understanding of that idol, this God of the USA. Okay. Forging this national God is accomplished in part through what Christian theology names supersessionism. Supersessionism is a heretical claim that the covenant of the Hebrew Scriptures is null and void, that the Jewish people are no longer God's chosen ones. In the US context, supersessionism would say that they have been replaced in God's heart with white American conservative Christians, and that America, from sea to shining sea, is the new promised land for these new chosen people. So this is tied with manifest destiny as well. Willie James Jennings calls supersessionism the most decisive and central theological distortion that exists in the church. When European Christians who were already saturated with centuries of anti-Semitic theology and practice found themselves upon the shores of the Americas, the temptation to see themselves as God's new chosen people entering a new promised land proved too great for them to resist. While today supersessionism is largely viewed within both Catholic and mainline Protestant Christian theology as a heresy, it lingers in the lived practice and imagination of U.S. Christians of all stripes, including in the vision that conservative charismatic Christians have of the role that the state of Israel plays in the bloody end times. Christian nationalism is a descendant of supersessionism. It is anti-Semitic, even if it purports to support Israel and the Jewish diaspora. And that's a whole nother paper, folks. So let's talk about practicing Christian nationalism today. I've talked a lot about theory. How is it practiced? And the short answer is it's practiced in support of conservative and specifically now, today, Republican political goals. I want to offer two vignettes as examples of this, and both meld conservative political causes and outright support for Republican candidates with that duplicitous Christianity and violent rhetoric. So we're going to start with this man, Sean Feucht. In 2020, Sean Feucht, who is a music minister or in evangelical parlance, a worship leader in the Bay Area, began leading outdoor prayer vigils to protest the COVID lockdowns, particularly insofar as they impacted Christian congregations. He was aggrieved at the idea that U.S. Christians are persecuted and viewed the lockdowns, especially the prohibitions on in-person gatherings, as an assault on religious liberty. While Feucht's protests began as local vigils, they quickly caught on amongst evangelical and especially charismatic Christians. Feucht took his Let Us Worship protest vigils on the road, leading large gatherings and singing evangelical worship music across the country and encouraging those present to be, quote, obnoxiously patriotic, end quote. I think that might be just to be nationalist, but well, not sure. Okay. Originally framed then as prayerful rallies for religious liberty, Feucht's rallies very quickly took on a host of other conservative political causes under the auspices of what Feucht calls a, quote, spiritual war, which he says was opposed to, quote, Satanists, Antifa, drag queens, and the rainbow religion, the LGBTQ wokeness religion. Perhaps most prominently, Feucht inserted himself into Portland, Oregon during BLM protests and subsequent unrest in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd, calling these events riots to revival and, quote, targeting cities marked by racial unrest. Feucht seemed to seek out and welcome clashes with BLM protesters, referring to his supporters as, quote, an army, and having them antagonize and bait local protesters with talk of, quote, spiritual warfare, armies of worshipers invading the government mountain, using worship as a weapon to expand spiritual territory. This rhetoric led Matthew Taylor to comment that Feucht's events seem less like religious revival and more like, quote, a guerrilla warfare campaign. Ultimately, Feucht would put his revivals and worship skills to work on behalf of getting Amy Coney Barrett confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, campaigning for Trump, and ultimately participating in the Stop the Steal movement that culminated in the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol. And let me be clear, Feucht can campaign for whatever he wants, right? I mean, by all means, campaign for your political interests and causes. He's doing it through worship services. right? And using worship music. That's not just campaigning for my causes, right? That's suggesting that I can marshal God for my causes in the same way. Still wrapping my head around that, but there's a difference. So I think it's critical to be aware that Foyt's fusion of evangelical worship music with Republican and far-right political causes and campaigns has only grown. Worship, quote, worship is increasingly becoming a central feature of right-wing political events. Worship is increasingly becoming a central feature of right-wing political events. Political rallies for Doug Mastriano, Carrie Lake, and Donald Trump have all included periods of evangelical or charismatic style worship. And on the one hand, again, by all means, pray away. But on the other, ask whether the God you're praying to is the all-loving and ever-living God or a mediocre American Idol. Let's also look at the Watchman Decree. In July of 2022, a viral video depicted a large charismatic Christian gathering in which leaders, including some associated with that new apostolic reformation I mentioned before, led a rock concert-like congregation in reciting the Watchman's Decree. And it's very difficult to describe this if you have not seen it. Has anyone seen the video? I always think that everyone's looking at what I'm looking at. They're clearly not. But I would encourage you to go and find it and watch it, because my description of it will not do justice to at least what for me was a foreboding feeling when I was watching it. The Watchman Decree begins, as a patriot of faith, I attest my allegiance first and foremost to the kingdom of God and the Great Commission. Good. Secondly, I agree to be a watchman over our nation concerning its people and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The watchmen then go on to declare their power and position, claiming to be, quote, God's governing body on earth, end quote, with, quote, legal power from heaven to exercise authority as world influencers, end quote. They then claim that God has, quote, equipped them and delegated to them the task to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy. So again, you have that religious, militaristic language coming in. The congregation then, again, thousands of people all together, go on to decree 13 statements, including the following. Actually, there are 6 that I want to discuss that really do resonate with what we've been talking about tonight. We decree that America's executive branch of government will honor God and defend the Constitution. There can be no dissonance between those, evidently. We decree that our legislative branch, Congress, will write only laws that are righteous and constitutional. We decree that our judicial system will issue rulings that are biblical and constitutional. We declare that we stand against wokeness, the occult, and every evil attempt against our nation. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership. We decree that the blood of Jesus covers and protects our nation. It protects and separates us for God. So I'm not sharing this to make fun or like to think that, oh, this is kooky, you know. I find it disturbing. And it ends with the group shouting the following words. We know this country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. We know the truth, therefore we stand for truth and will never be deceived. We will never stop fighting. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. Serious ethical issues regarding Christian nationalism range from its being, as we've talked about, anti-Black, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic, to its embrace of historical inaccuracy. As we've seen, it's an ideology that sows division and normalizes political violence. Perry and Whitehead, again, as I mentioned above, found a strong positive correlation between the belief that God requires the faithful to wage wars for good and Christian nationalist commitments. And indeed, the symbol of blood flows freely among Christian nationalists. Jesus' blood shed on the cross as salvific sacrifice is compared to the blood shed by U.S. military service members. But blood is not only a religious symbol, it is often also functioning as a political symbol of exclusion or ethno-national purity and of the violence, shedding blood in battle, necessary to maintain blood purity. If they are poisoning the blood of our nation, then surely we must drive them out. For the Christian nationalists, then, there is no, quote, irreducible moral dilemma, to use a phrase coined by Lisa Cahill, when it comes to bloodshed in political struggle. Christian nationalism combines an apocalyptic sense of social decline and moral decay in the United States with a vision of God as a militant warrior on the side of his chosen people, white Christian Americans who do battle under God's banner to heal and sanctify and purify the blood of the nation. In its most extreme iteration, Christian nationalism views political violence as holy, an expression of faith and patriotism, which indeed for Christian nationalists are one and the same. Thus, studies have found that, quote, Christian nationalism in the United States is associated with increased support for political violence. It's sobering to acknowledge that in 2022, the same year that that Watchman decree went viral, and by the way, that's not gone. Look it up. Many, many churches have it on their websites and encourage their people to pray it every day. In 2022, that same year, 10% of Americans, which is to say, my friends, 33 million individual people, expressed the belief that violence against the US government would be justifiable under the current Biden administration. 33 million. I think we got off better than we might have, you know? So we need to begin to call this what it is, Christian extremism. We've said that Christian nationalism is both vice in the philosophical sense and sin in the theological sense. As a sin of idolatry, Christian nationalism forges this national God, and both throughout history and today demonstrates its willingness to do violence in the name of this God. Indeed, instead of acknowledging Christ nailed to the cross by state-sanctioned violence, it embraces state-sanctioned violence to secure its privileges, placing borders and barbed wire and rows of guns around its supposedly promised land, trying to keep it holy and pure. But Christian nationalists are failing to ask a critical question. What if God is outside the wall? What if the body of Christ is not to be found inside strong walls and razor wire, but in broken migrants and huddled masses yearning to be free? Are these pictures accurate? Is that the face of Jesus in America today? With the MAGA hat, embracing Donald Trump and hugging the flag tenderly? Or is it more like this? A Christ mocked by Christian nationalism, flogged and forced to wear the flag of the state that tortures him, crowned with the bullets used to kill in his name. Christian nationalism mocks Jesus Christ. It calls Jesus Lord in the same way that Pilate called him King of the Jews. But the trouble that we're faced with is more duplicitous yet. Pilate knew he was mocking Jesus, and Christian nationalists are convinced that they are honoring him. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. We're going to have some time to have questions asked both online and here in the room.
The title of the presentation talked about resisting Christian nationalism. So I thank you for the amazing elucidation of it. I'm left still asking what I and we can do specifically to resist it.
So I'm going to give you the cop-out reason why I didn't include resistance, and then we can actually talk about resistance. And I know I'm not the only one in the room who knows about resistance. So the cop-out reason is, so first of all, I gave the title a while ago and then crafted the presentation, which is what we do. But as I was writing and working on it, I did have a little bit of a sense of needing to sit with the sinfulness of it all, if that makes any sense. So I sometimes tell my students when we're talking about sin and conscience, like just let yourself be aware for a minute of your complicity in sin, and just don't try to jump too quick to hope, right? Hope is important. Like, we're going to get to resurrection, God willing. But sometimes just sitting there at the foot of the cross, I think is also important. That's the cop-out answer. But in terms of resistance, I'm going to say a couple things, and then I'm going to ask for a few people who are out here doing this work to by all means, tell me. You and I both participated in prayerful vigils at the ICE Detention Center here in Pittsburgh. That's a form of resistance. I wish we had more protests that involved long periods of silent staring at government buildings by thousands of people, right? Shouting is great, but sometimes just standing there is a very powerful witness. And it's counter-cultural to sort of protest culture as it currently functions. I would also say there is the everyday work, and again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in this room, of calling your elected officials, right, around the policies that are being enacted, that are doing harm to migrants and refugees, that are doing harm to trans individuals, that are taking resources away from our communities in terms of racial justice organizations, poverty organizations, the arts, yeah.
I'm aware of Network, the Catholic Religious Women, and what they tried to do to bring Catholic social teaching to our past election. Mm-hmm. But are there some other voices, theological voices, that are getting some airtime?
That's a good question. I mean, so Network is excellent. New Ways Ministry is doing work on the LGBTQ front. When I say struggling for theological airtime, part of what I'm thinking of is this group right here. You guys are struggling for theological airtime, right? You're a group of Christians and Catholics who are, I'm being a little presumptive here, but I think largely in opposition to this stuff, right? That a whole other side of Christianity is promoting as though it is in fact the will of God, right? And those people are all over the news, right? And people are writing books about them. I'm going to put up here right now. And that's important. We need to be analyzing them, but they're also all over the airwaves, right? They have podcasts. They have television networks. They have a massive media marketing campaign, T-shirts, right? I mean, truly, they have embraced the benefits of capitalism, right, for their movement. And so that's kind of what I mean in terms of struggling for theological airtime. One podcast I would recommend is Straight White American Jesus. Some people know that maybe. And they do look at sort of the ways in which theological discourse is becoming idolatrized in different ways. So that's another one that's out there, but again, nobody has heard of it. Sorry, I'm taking a long time answering questions.
So we're going to go online for a few questions first.
I have some some questions I can put together. And the series of questions relate to how deep does this go? In your experience, do you actually see this in any students? Because we see so many students that or young people that are in the Magna group. The Catholic bishops, are they supporting or tolerating this this type of thing? And the third one, kind of related, is these people are so muddled. Can we ever love them enough to straighten them out?
I'll take the last question first and say yes, and leave it at that, right? I do, again, I remember being in front of the ICE detention center a couple of Fridays ago and praying for the people inside, and it was explicitly mentioned we were going to pray for the ICE agents, right? And people saying, every day I pray for Donald Trump. Yeah? So I hope so. And then your other question was about
How deep does
it go? The bishops are not a monolith, right? They're not one thing. So there are excellent and wonderful bishops like Bishop McElroy and others who I do think are aware of this as a problem. There are also ecumenical bishops, by the way. I was just looking at an Episcopalian bishop's statement against Christian nationalism earlier today. I do think the bishops are very disturbed by the ICE detentions and the roundups. I think that has rattled them. With regards to what otherwise felt like a lot of support within the bishops' ranks for a second Trump presidency. And in terms of young people and students, I think that they do mirror the rest of the population, at least in my experience. Different parts of the country probably have different populations, but here in Western Pennsylvania, we have folks that are very aware of this as a problem and are working and want to be taught how to work to resist it, and others who want to promote it. So yeah.
I know sister, and then we'll go right to the
Hello. Yeah, and I just wanted to, many people feel that Christian nationalism is just something that's modern, and yet historically, it started at the institution of our nation. So, I hope you would refer a little bit to that. And secondly, Nostra Aetate has taught us that Judaism is our mother, and our faith flows from Judaism. So, once again, I think we need to be reminded of those things.
Do you want me to comment on that, or is just okay? The point you're making about history is really important. I think I shared an article that I wrote with some of you when you asked me to speak, and by all means distribute that, but it does share some of the historical development of this. The one thing that I tell my students in religious liberty is that the Puritans who came here to the United States to settle in the new land because they were fleeing religious persecution and really wanted religious liberty, they wanted religious liberty for themselves, right? They weren't setting up a colony or a set of colonies that was religiously, that had religious freedom and plurality. In fact, they drove out anybody who even, had a whiff of being slightly dissenting from the dominant theological perspective. That's really why Rhode Island exists and why it's called Providence, right? Is because the founder of Rhode Island was driven out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he refused to recant his belief in religious liberty, and he went and started the Providence, Rhode Island colony. Fun fact. It is also as I hope I did trace to some degree, right, the way in which it is used to both support slavery and Jim Crow laws and segregation. So hopefully, was there anything else you wanted me to touch on there?
I think the point that's important to me is we think that it
modern.
It's not new.
And it from the institution of the country.
Yeah.
We had it.
And it's always been being resisted,
Right.
which is also important, right?
Right.
So that whole litany of the trajectory of discipleship that I did towards the beginning, right, of the social gospel movement and the Dorothy Day and more recently William Barber, and again you, right?
There was something on your the table that you had about the 10 things about whether they
Indicators?
would be Christian nationalist. And the last one was education. And it seems there is a big economic component of there's a lot of poor white folks who are on that bandwagon. There's also a lot of middle class and business owners. So I don't quite understand that. I think that that's also a big part of it. So I don't know if you can speak to that. And I just want to say, I listened to Richard Rohr, very uplifting, and talks about ways that you can do things. Yeah, he's got a new book. Anyway, thanks for letting me. So education.
I mean, I think I want to believe that education is a way to break through ideology of all kinds. Sometimes it does work and sometimes it doesn't. We are in a particularly strange and somewhat new era, especially with young folks, of getting all of their information online via algorithms that decide what they're going to see based on any number of factors, from whether or not they like spaghetti to whether they hit like on a particular video to what kind of music they listen to. So, oh, I listen to country music. Suddenly my entire, newsfeed is filled with, let's say, Republican talking points, right? And so that does put education, like formal education, at a disadvantage. And it's something that we're gonna have to deal with. I think that we should all go home and tomorrow morning, bright and early, call your representatives and tell them you want big tech companies to be regulated and not to have algorithms that are capable of shuffling us into little, what do they call them, echo chambers, right? And distorting our view of reality. So there's your homework assignment, I guess, right? I do believe in power. I believe, I know that some people view power negatively. I view power as fundamentally neutral until it's used. So I love making people feel more powerful than they think they are. I do. None of us are powerless. The last word is from a theologian, ethicist, political scientist named Jean Bethke Elshtain. And I just shared this with my graduate students today. So if any of them are out there, some of them said they might be online, you will recognize this. She's an Augustine scholar at both at the religious and political level, and I don't agree with everything she's ever said, but this is good. She says, in the choice between discipleship or duplicity, and then she says, different understandings of power are at work. There's the power of earthly dominion, but there are other forms of power, forms that are generative, not controlling, that are exemplified most fully in God's power to generate a world that God loves. Because earthly power is tied to the temptation to dominate, there can be no such thing as an earthly sacral society or state. God forbid we should sacralize our earthly arrangements in this way. Clearly, Augustine would have a thing or two to say to those folks who would equate America with a sacral order. This is not God's country, Augustine would surely say, but yet another nation under God's judgment.